Grant, well, thanks very much, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Grant, okay. Getting some nods from the back. So I'm going to do a presentation on something called cross-origin resource sharing today, and misconfigurations in them from a pen testing perspective. But hopefully if you're on the blue team side of the fence or you're a dev, then hopefully you'll find this interesting and a bit useful as well. So there's going to be a structure of our talk. So I'm going to go through sort of the basics of the tech behind cross-origin resource sharing. It is going to be a bit theoretical for a little bit of time. Sorry about that. You're just going to have to power through it, I'm afraid. But it really is necessary to the rest of the presentation and informing us how we actually find these issues in real life and understand the consequences of a misconfigured cause policy as well. So before we begin in depth, everyone likes a good classic "Who am I" slide. So I'm a pen tester at KPMG in our cyber defense services team. I am a Czech team leader. Did the infrastructure exam with CS because I hate JavaScript. Essentially. So I'm officially sort of on the infrastructure side of the pen testing realm, but that doesn't always end up happening with all my work, so I sort of work across applications as well as a variety of other things. Haven't always been in OffSec or even in cybersecurity, really. Before as a pen tester, I was in some of our other services at KPMG, sort of more assurance type work, and moved over onto offensive security, and read a social science in my undergraduate degree, so not your typical sort of CompSci affair. So that's the relevant bits of me and why I'm talking. So why a talk on cross-origin resource sharing? Well, if actually you could have a brief show of hands, how many people here are either pen testers or have pen tested or somewhat familiar with the field? Few hands, but not everyone. Grant, okay, that's good. So if you are one of those people, you may or may not have seen statements like this in a report, either from a vendor or just online, which can look sensible at first, but then when you get into the depths of what cause is, they start to make less and less sense, as we'll see later. But this talk in particular has been prompted by me reading one too many reports with these kind of statements, which sort of betray a lack of understanding of what cause is and the context in which we should view a quote-unquote misconfigured cause policy. And out of that frustration, I built this talk out. So hopefully we'll get a bit of an understanding as we go through as to why I've been a bit frustrated with this. But there are some common pitfalls, as you can see here, with how you can see cause findings that have been raised previously. And that is partly because there's been sort of somewhat disparate and in some cases incorrect resources out there online about cause issues. So this talk aims to address that. So why do we actually care about cause issues? What's the impact, right? Ultimately, it's all about gaining unauthorized access to sensitive information or to protected resources or data in a web application. It can also result in account takeover in some cases. It can lead to a bypass of security controls, especially if they're location or IP address based. So things like intranet sites from the public internet. And it can lead to other follow-on issues as well, services like cache poisoning, which can then form part of a much wider attack path. So cause misconfigurations can be quite fiddly, quite annoying to deal with, to find and then exploit. But once you do find them, you can get yourself some really nice findings. And write a very impressive report to your client, hopefully, rather than just, here's a 1.0 CVSS score in my report, then I'm just going to leave it at that. So, going to have to go through the foundations of CORS and same origin policy. I know that a lot of people here will be quite techie people, and the one thing that techie people love is theory, of course, but I do promise it really is necessary. So not the most exciting start, which is always how you should start a talk, but it is really necessary. So let's start with what is an origin, right? We're talking about cross-origin resource sharing. Well, an origin consists of three parts. A protocol or scheme, so your HTTP or HTTPS, your domain, which is inclusive of subdomains, and your port. So essentially, when we talk about issuing a cross-origin request, what we're talking about is one application or one origin making a request via a user's browser to a different origin. So we have a sending origin and a receiving origin, which will be our target. To make a cross-origin request, essentially one of these three components, your protocol, your domain, or your port number, has to be different between the two origins. If all of these are the same, this isn't a cross-origin request. And so that's a really important thing to take note of. A change in the URL path does not count as a change in origin. So that's something to bear in mind. What is the same origin policy, and why is it relevant here? So the SOP is a part of the web standards that we sort of take for granted today. It essentially applies to web browsers, and by default it prevents a browser from issuing a cross-origin request. So that's baked in. That is highly restrictive, and it's designed to be so. And it's essentially intended to prevent scripts from a sending origin to access sensitive data from another origin. This will include restricting scripts from accessing data from any other origin, so that includes your authentication information, such as session cookies or other credentials, sensitive data in your application responses, or malicious scripts hosted on an attacker-controlled domain, among other things. So the SOP is designed to essentially stop cross-origin requests from happening. So that obviously can be quite restrictive if you've ever done any web dev work. So we want some way to relax that while allowing us to restrict what origins can send cross-origin requests back to us. And that's what CORS is. It's a relaxation, or a controlled relaxation, we say, of the same origin policy. And essentially, we need this essentially so that a web application that we've developed can access data from any other origin, be that an API, from a third party, a subdomain, or some other system. It might reasonably need to retrieve some other resource to do its job. That's what CORS allows us to do. And this is essentially implemented by specifying the origins that can make cross-origin requests back to us. So we specify the origin, or origins, in our application configuration, and we specify which resources those origins can send those requests to as well. And we also specify whether those requests can be credentialed, so i.e., can it access all resources or data that should normally require authentication. I'm going to use the terms site B or evil.com or site A throughout. Our site B is going to be our retrieving or our sending origin, and our site A is going to be our receiving origin. In practice, CORS looks like this. A key component of cross-origin resource sharing is the user's browser. If there is no web browser involved, then you're not going to be able to exploit a CORS misconfiguration. We'll get into the specifics of why a bit later. But essentially, a user via a web browser has to visit your ascending origin or your evil.com, and that data needs to be permitted by the receiving origin or your victim site to access some protected resource or protected data on there. That can happen by either a simple cross-origin request or via a pre-flight request followed by a cross-origin request. Again, we'll get into specifics of the differences between those and why that's important in a bit. But suffice to say, looking at the configuration of our receiving origin is really important. So, more theory. I know you've been waiting for it. We are almost there, onto the more exciting stuff, but we're going to have to get to the last little bit of theory before we do. So, in order for a origin to send a cross-origin request, this has to involve something called the cause header exchange. The reason why we care about this is that essentially we don't, as pen testers or as offensive security professionals, what we're really interested in is sensitive, protected data that should require authentication on the target website, right, or the target origin more accurately. We don't really care about some generic homepage that you can send a cross-origin request to, because that would reasonably not host anything too sensitive, right? So we need to take a look at the header exchange and whether the application configuration allows us to send a proper cross-origin request end-to-end. There are two types of cross-origin request that I mentioned earlier, so simple and pre-flighted. We'll go through the process of a simple cause request first, and this is essentially what it looks like. So we have our victim browser, our evil.com, which is our malicious domain that we are hosting as a pen tester, and our victim.com. So in a simple request, it will consist of either a get, a head, or an options request. No other method is allowed for a simple cross-origin request. And you have to use one of a small number of content types for the request as well. So either URL encoded or text plain, or multi-part form data content types as well. If it's any other content type, then you're going to be sending a pre-flighted request. And essentially what happens in this simple cause exchange is that the malicious domain that we are hosting will direct the user's browser to send, after initial request, to send a cross-origin request over to our victim. And if permitted, if the origin that we have specified in our origin request header is permitted, then it will send back an access control allow origin header, reflecting back dynamically the malicious domain that we have specified, and an access control allow credentials with the value of true. Both of those components are necessary. The credentials header essentially tells our browser whether it can send a follow-up, send a request with credentials to a protected area of the site, and the origin determines which origin is allowed to do that. Pre-flighted requests are a bit more complicated, but the first couple of stages are the same. What does change is that before the main cross-origin request, an options request is sent via the user's browser. And what this does is it essentially solicits the target website on whether it is permitted to send that second request. So again, we have a dynamically reflected ACAL header specifying our evil.com and allow credentials header as well. We also get two other headers with allow methods and allow headers, which specify, obviously, which methods and which headers are allowed to be sent in the following request. And then the rest of the flow is just like a simple cross-origin request. These pre-flights occur when you have other content type values. So, for instance, when you send JSON, for instance, in a post request, that's going to induce a pre-flighted CORS request. And so essentially you have a solicitation stage and then the actual request. So I mentioned a few of those. This is just a rundown of what those headers are. Our malicious domain is what is going to instruct the browser to specify its own origin in the cross-origin request or in the pre-flight. And then what we're really looking for is for that to be reflected back dynamically and not statically. If it's static, then you essentially don't have an issue because the target application needs to essentially respond to the specific data that you're sending. So if you're finding that you're putting in evil.com and it's still sending an asterisk, that's you've not got an issue, essentially. And that's one of the common pitfalls that we'll see later. So these are the response headers that we saw earlier. Allow credentials and allow origin are really the most important, but you will need a valid method for your follow-on request if you have sent a pre-flight, and you'll need valid headers in there as well. That specifies any additional headers that will need to be sent, for instance, authorization, if the credentials that need to be sent over to the target require something like basic authentication, for instance. So, now a bit more to the fun part. So, what are credentials? I was talking about this earlier. So, there are a few different types. The most common you'll probably find is session tokens in your cookies. But you can also have cross-origin requests that specify HTTP basic, digest, or NTLM credentials as well. There are also other ranges, such as client certificates as well. But these will be the most common. Essentially, what you need is a credential that will automatically be sent by the browser without the user having to essentially interfere with the cross-origin process. And this is just to emphasize as well that the user's web browser is a critical component of this, because otherwise there's no method for our malicious origin to send that request to our target in the first place. So what I commonly see in vendor reports is that we have somebody who has been very excited while they're writing the vulnerability. They're testing an app-to-app API that uses something like bearer authentication, or something that simply isn't going to be accessed via a web browser, but instead by a thick client of some sort. And they've said, well, that's responded dynamically to my request, and therefore there's a cause misconfiguration high-risk finding. But there's no web browser involvement at all, so it's not actually exploitable. So worth reporting, but it's not going to be a very high-risk finding. Yes. So this is what pre-flight looks like. So as we can see, we have the target, the malicious domain specified in the origin header, with a specific port number, and then the victim application is sending that back dynamically with an allow credentials true. And then in the follow-on request after the pre-flight, what we can see here is that a session cookie has been included in that request. So that second request is now credentialed because it's been permitted to send, the browser's been permitted to send that after the solicitation. And then we get our API key or whatever sensitive data that we're targeting. This is essentially what it looks like with basic authentication. Most of us will be aware of this. But for those of us who aren't, when you have HTTP basic authentication with the application, and you're first going to get a response for an unauthorized with a www authenticate header, specifying the type of authentication you need. The user will then will then provide their credentials to the target application, and that will get sent on in an authorization basic header. And then subsequently, when the user submits requests to the website to protected resources, that will automatically be sent via the browser. The user doesn't need to intervene anymore and provide their credentials again in the same way. That does differ with other types of authentication. So, for instance, bearer tokens. So you can have your authorization bearer and then often a JWT. Though a bearer token is not going to be sent automatically via the browser. That's something that the user has to specify in the request, essentially manually. When you have bearer authentication, you're not going to have an exploitable vulnerability in this way, because essentially the attack relies on the victim's browser automatically sending those credentials in the request. Otherwise, you as the attacker have to know and be able to retrieve that token, which you're very unlikely to be able to do. So, a proof of concept. This is very, very basic, but a proof of concept would look something like this in an attack. So you would create a malicious web page and put some JavaScript in it, specifying your target. And for instance here, API secret key, for example. You would need to specify the method that you're going to send, that your malicious web page is going to instruct the user's web browser to send to the victim. You're going to need to instruct it to send it as with credentials, so credentials include, and as well the headers that are required for that request, particularly important for when it might require a pre-flight. So if it's JSON data, for example. So very brief, but that's essentially what the kind of script you're looking for will look like. Have a very short video here, which shows what that does look like, if it will work. Will it work?
Do you need sound?
No, I don't. Great. It does work, okay. So this is Baby's first Flask application. And what we can see here is a request to an API key, which requires authentication to retrieve. That's our POC website. Little button that sends. But in this case, what we see is that our pre-flight hasn't worked for some reason. And that hasn't worked because of the specific browser that we're using and the controls that are applied to that browser. So if you've ever used the browser before, you'll know that's Chromium. But when we switch to Microsoft Edge, we see that it has worked suddenly. And we can see here the pre-flight has received a positive response. So we can see the correct headers. And then we can see the follow-on request has also received a positive response because it's passed the solicitation, and it's sent. The browser sent the request with the session cookie. Good to stop that. Okay, so why did we observe that strange behavior between two different browsers doing two different things? Essentially, it's down to how cookies are treated between different browsers. So certain cookie attributes can throw a bit of a spanner in the works when we're looking at CORS requests and CORS issues. So most of us will know what HTTP only does, but essentially, if it is set on a cookie, it will prevent JavaScript from on the web page from accessing it. So key security control. You also have the secure cookie, which aims to prevent transmission over unsecure protocols. And you also have the same site cookie, which gets very annoying very quickly. And essentially, the important thing to note is that in the absence of an application specifying what same-site policy is going to apply, most modern browsers these days will enforce the lax policy. What does that mean? Well, there are 3 different types of policies you can apply, so either none, lax, or strict. With none, the secure flag will always be required. And with lax, essentially what this means is that the cookie is not going to be sent in background requests. But essentially what this actually is sent to will change how the browser, whether the browser allows you to send a cross-origin request. And that's why you end up with errors looking like this. If you're a web dev, sorry for the PTSD. But you will find this a lot. Essentially, since 2021, Chrome and Chromium, which includes the Burp browser, will apply the lax restriction by default, which is what we observed earlier. So we saw that the Burp browser wasn't actually sending cross-origin requests, but without any change to Microsoft Edge, it was. And that's because Microsoft Edge just doesn't do this by default at the time of speaking. But Chromium does block it by default. So that's something as a tester that you're going to have to make sure that you check, you double check your tools and how they're configured. And don't just assume that because your POC isn't working, that therefore there is no issue. Make sure you go into your browser settings and modify the configuration as need be to allow third-party cookies to be sent in cross-origin requests. Annoyingly, as I found out in Exeter a month or so ago, about the day before, Chrome changed a policy that it was going to implement to drop support for third-party cookies by default. It's U-turned on that. So for now, this is the way that Chrome and Chromium behave. But that will not necessarily be the case forever. So just as a bit of a warning. And you see there in the bottom right, that's the behavior that you will see when you open the Burp browser usually. They will tell you essentially that I am blocking third-party cookies by default. And you want to basically tell it, allow me to send these in cross-origin requests. So this is the same thing as earlier. But rather than using the same site none attribute, we're using the same site lax. And what we see here in our Burp browser, if we simply press this button, then suddenly it's working again. Literally that simple. Something that can be very easily missed when you're in a rush on a test. Okay, right. So, as we close out, some common pitfalls and things to avoid. The first thing is not checking that the application responds dynamically to our origin requests. So, according to the actual web standard, this is what it says. So when responding to a credentialed request, the server must specify an origin in the value of the ACAL header instead of specifying the wildcard. So if you're just seeing a wildcard, no matter what you send in the origin request, in the origin header, you've not got an exploitable issue. So make sure that you avoid just raising a finding that's high risk just because you saw the header in the first place. That's not good. Another pitfall can be not checking that the resource requires authentication. Don't just do it on generic home pages, and not testing outside of Burp. So as we saw earlier, in order to demonstrate an attack path, we need to work with our browser. Don't just send origin payloads in Burp and then stop. Then make sure that you try things end to end. It'll be much more interesting and much more impressive to your client. Don't be fooled by this, and do just double check the type of credentials that you are sending. So bear in mind the difference between bearer tokens and other types of credentialed request, and check your cookie attributes as well. So I will leave you with this checklist. So it's very simple, really, when it comes down to it. Check that your ACAL headers are dynamically generated in the responses. Make sure that they are protected resources that you are targeting. Check the authentication method that's actually been used and the controls that may apply to it. Determine whether the requests require a pre-flight, because that will require a change to your POC. And confirm that everything actually works outside of Burp Suite. There is more to the world of web applications than Burp Suite, I promise you. And make sure you double check your browser settings as well when you're exercising your POC. So thanks very much for listening. I hope it's been interesting for you as the last talk of the day. I know that's the last thing we want to hear at the end of the long day, web apps. But if you want to reach out to me, I'm not very present online, but there I am. That is the best picture KPMG could do. I can't explain it, but clearly their fault. But yeah, thanks very much for listening, and yeah.
Questions?
Yeah.
How many less minutes? You've got 4 minutes? Yeah. Any questions? Yeah, I'm good.
So, Cory, why do you not like JavaScript?
There was a great man that once told me that JavaScript was made by drunk engineers. So that's probably the reason why. I think I need to be at a certain level of inebriation to sort of understand JavaScript. And that's the main reason.
Come on, any other questions?
Hi, great talk, by the way. Looking back at what you presented there, so if you've got a web application that's got cookies that are sent with same-site LACs, they can technically still be vulnerable depending on the browser that they're using and what settings they're applying. So, for example, if they were to click on that link and to allow that third-party cookies, and that would essentially mean that the full exploit could essentially be done. However, if they had the same site set to just its own domain, then essentially it can't be exploited. Is that pretty much?
Yeah. So the key thing with LACs as well is that so firstly, the user's browser does need to allow the sending of third-party cookies in the request. So for now, some browsers behave differently than others. So that is one thing which when you're doing your write-up, or if you're on the receiving end of the report, you need to interrogate. So, if it's an internet application, for example, or something on an internal network, it might be reasonably a bit more likely that your users would be using something like Microsoft Edge. But if it's a public-facing application, that might be slightly less likely, because who on earth likes Microsoft Edge? The other thing with the LACs attribute is that it requires what's called a top-level navigation to the web page for it to actually send a cross-origin request. So that will essentially fancy language for following a link to the web page rather than getting to the web page as a link from another web page, essentially, rather than just clicking a phishing link, for example. So that's something you'd have to consider as well. It makes the attack path slightly longer and a bit less likely, but in theory, yes, it is still vulnerable.
Thank you.
Any more for any more? With that, I'd like to thank Cory.
Okay.
Let's give another round of applause. Cool. Okay, well, I think that concludes